I've done a lot of work in other parts of the world, so specifically Latin America, Central America, a little bit in China, thinking about who benefits when there's an agricultural transition. When there are new commercial prospects and there are new markets opening up, who gets to participate in those new opportunities, right? So who benefits? We know from studying these kinds of transitions in South America, in Central America, in parts of South Asia, some people benefit. This is an obvious fact, but it's important to reiterate, some people do not benefit, right? And we also know that the way that you anticipate who's going to benefit, the way that you design services, the way that you design policies affects who benefits, right? So the way that we anticipate that really matters in terms of the kinds of welfare outcomes that we're going to see. So that's really important. So the big questions here for me that I've been thinking about and I think are relevant given some of the talks that we've been hearing are what is the farmer level variation that we need to be thinking about, right? So what farmer level variation seems to be important to anticipating who the beneficiaries are and who's left behind. And then can the existing public and private systems, and I'm mostly going to talk about private systems, but they're particularly important in Africa, I think, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa because the public systems aren't working, I would argue, at least in most places. Can those systems respond to anticipated new demands from farmers? Okay, so part of my past research and research of others, so Chris Barrett, Jenny Aker, other folks, has established that there's all of these things related to roads and cell phone networks and irrigation that matters for determining who gets into new markets. Those kinds of geographic and infrastructural endowments are really critical. I'm going to focus on this other piece, which I've gotten really interested in part because of work that I've done in my postdoc work with Cheryl and Pedro, which is this agronomically and economically important variation in soil nutrient limitations. In particular, I'm going to talk about East and Southern Africa. Okay? So I think a new thing, at least for economists, that we need to think about a little bit more carefully when we're thinking about these kinds of changes that we're going to see. Okay, so this is really related to what Pedro was talking about yesterday in a couple of fundamental ways. So this is part of a study that we were doing in Tanzania in the Morogoro region. So this is a square, it's about 120 square miles near Morogoro, Tanzania. And what we're doing there is we're actually taking soil doc, which is this testing lab test kit where you can do soil tests in the field. And we're doing tests of soils, and then we're giving that information to farmers in combination with some liquidity, and we're looking to see if they actually respond. So if you give farmers information about their soils, it's an implicit hypothesis to a lot of what we've been talking about here. Do they actually act on it? So it's a whole study, and I can talk about that if people are interested. But what I'm going to talk about right now is, again, here we see what I would argue is pretty significant variation in what the nutrient limitations are that farmers face within a pretty constrained geographic area. Okay? So as I said, it's about 120 square mile area. It's 1,001 randomly selected farmers, and we had them identify what their primary maize plot was. Then we tested that maize plot. Okay, so what you can see is these are the same classifications. We're using the same tool that Pedro was talking about. Right, so farmers that are N-limited, NK, NPNS, NKS, NPS, NPKS. Right, so fields are exhibiting 8 different combinations of nutrient limitations within this pretty small geographic area. And we can look at the same data in a slightly different way. So I'm going to pick out 2 things that are important here. So those are the same farmer fields, but just listed by the share that fall into these different classifications. So, so 2 things I want you to note. So one is the blanket recommendation for maize production in the area is the application of NP by the Tanzanian government, right? And that's the relevant recommendation for 5 of the farmers in our out of 1,000. Okay, so people are limited primarily in S, but there's nothing about S, right? And that seems to be really important. I think that's really important. And the other thing that's interesting to know is if we start looking at the intra-cluster correlation coefficients, so how much of the information about your soil parameter, right, the measure of different parameters of your soil quality, how much of that is predicted just by virtue of the village that you're in, right? We get really low predictions for some of these variables, right? So 0.004% of your variation in your active carbon is predicted by where you are. That's really low, right? So that means that there's a lot of even within village heterogeneity that could be really important here. And that matters in a couple ways I'm going to talk about. So, and then this is consistent with emerging evidence that we have in central Malawi, western Kenya. I know Pedro and Cheryl have accumulated evidence about this in other places as well. Right. So I think that matters in 3 important ways. So it matters because of information issues that we've talked about already. You're going to need more calibrated recommendations if we think these farmers have the potential to be commercially successful, right? What's being offered right now doesn't seem to be appropriate in many places. For extension, this matters from an economic perspective, this kind of variation, because farmers learn in different ways when they have different kinds of heterogeneity and underlying agronomic conditions, right? There's a number of studies. So there's a really nice one by Munshi from 2004 that shows the Green Revolution technologies spread in different ways in India based on how similar the agronomic characteristics were, essentially. And then the third, which I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes talking about, is inputs, right? So we need capable agricultural input supply chains to deliver the type, quantity, and quality of inputs that farmers need. And I think that this evidence of soil variation across farmers means that we have to have even better input supply chains than we would otherwise. They have to do better than they would have to do if you had everybody with similar kinds of constraints and similar kinds of problems with their soils, okay? They have to provide information, recommendations, quality inputs, special blends, smaller package qualities, credit, all this stuff. Okay, so I'm going to argue a more pessimistic view than what Pedro said yesterday. I'm not sure that they're there. So this is what I'm going to show you. So this is work that I've done with Anna Fairbairn, who's here. She's an MS student in the department who was in Tanzania all year last year. If you want to know anything about input supply chains in East Africa, talk to Anna. She's the expert on this. This is data she collected. So she collected about 800 samples of fertilizer from input dealers and also from farmers. This is just the urea samples from input dealers. We also have CAN and DAP. And then we had this tested. She drove vans of fertilizer across the border to Nairobi to have these things tested. We sent them to Thornton Labs in Florida, so we've got double testing of some of the samples. Right, and so what this is showing is how much nitrogen was in the samples that we had tested. So and it's all urea, so it should be 46%, right? So what we see is, on average, about 10% of the nitrogen is missing from mineral fertilizer that she tested, right? She tested it two different times in the year. She's got some nice temporal variation, lots of spatial variation. I'll show you that in the last thing I'm going to show you. So that's interesting, right? And this is consistent with evidence people are finding in other places. So Uganda, they found about 30% of the nutrients are missing from urea in Uganda in a recent study. Similar problems with herbicides in Uganda, and then some work's going on now in Kenya on seeds and also on fertilizer. Right? Okay, so I would argue, so the other thing to notice that I think is interesting here is you've got a lot of our samples that are just missing a little bit. They're missing 3%. Right? And so when people look at this and they hear what Anna's working on, a lot of the time people are prepared to hear an adulteration story, that you've got like nefarious dealers that are cutting their product, right? And that's probably happening in some cases, right? So we see some stuff that looks pretty bad. But I think in a lot of cases what's happening is they don't have storage, they have bad logistics, they don't have credit, and so you're having these sort of small losses, which I would argue are still pretty important agronomically and economically, right? And it's a different kind of a problem, and it requires different kinds of policies, right? So, okay, so not just adulteration, that's really important, but I think also degradation. And so I'll just show you one last piece just as a teaser, because this is the kind of stuff Anna's working on now. So she went out and she surveyed and found, this is from all of the input dealers that she could find in this region of Tanzania, right? In the same region actually where we're doing the information testing work in Morogoro, right? So these are all the different agro-input dealers that she surveyed. We have these long surveys that she did, and then these are the urea samples. So we're trying to look at is trying to tease out how much of it might be adulteration, to try to see where the problems are emerging in the supply chain, to try to understand what the constraints are and how the specific kinds of supply chain constraints seem to be related to the degradation that we're seeing, right, in the quality of the fertilizer. So just in closing, some closing thoughts here. Right, so there are these new market opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of work going on documenting what's pushing that, right? Increased urbanization, rising incomes, lots of stuff is starting to happen. Right? But to think about who's going to participate and to anticipate the kind of policies we need, there's lots of stuff that economists tend to think about and policymakers are good at thinking about. Not that we're good at solving the problems, but we know they're problems, right? Credit, infrastructure, mechanisms to aggregate lots of small farmers into bigger quantities for sale, storage, risk, right? But I think we need to pay a lot more attention to understanding why we see certain kinds of variation, predicting where there's more variation and less variation in characteristics that are important agronomically, and then also understanding what this agri-dealer capacity issue is and trying to figure out how can agri-dealers potentially respond to incentives to improve quality, when are they not going to respond, right? And how can we work with existing networks to get better quality inputs, right? Because everybody here is talking about commercialization hinging to some degree on getting inputs into the system. We have to think about what the quality of the inputs is that we're getting into the system. So lots of people that we're working with and lots of important funders, including the ACE Office of International Programs, to acknowledge. So thanks very much. So in most cases with these plots, we see that folks have been farming them for a while. Actually, and one thing that's really interesting to note with this is that so there's 1,000 farmers, and do you know how many used fertilizer the year before? Mineral fertilizer? Out of 1,000? What do you think? Guess. I will need 8. 8 farmers used fertilizer the year before. It's a really low rate, right? So I agree with you, there's lots of questions to be answered. Also about, yeah, well, you know, there's not, yeah, it's a great question. I think it has to be part of the investigation. Yeah. So the soil scientists all say it's management, right? But then I'm really interested, so I'll make somebody talk to me about this at lunch, but I'm really interested in how differences in the underlying characteristics can lead to different kinds of variation due to management. Do you know what I mean? That's a really interesting question. So, and I know they're all interested from an economic perspective, and I'm curious from an economic perspective. Yes, Jack?